Welcome to Fiery Nights, where the darkest stories unfold in the stillness of the night. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you safely curled up in your room or perhaps surrounded by the noise of others? Or maybe you find yourself in a quiet, haunting place alone with your thoughts and the whispers of something far more sinister. Wherever you are, I invite you to settle in. Tonight's tale will take you into the heart of darkness, a place where the line between the living and the dead is thin, and the silence is deafening. Story 1. In the dead of night, the stillness of an abandoned house hung like a suffocating blanket. The walls, once adorned with the vibrant hues of life, were now a dull gray, scarred by years of neglect. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something older, something forgotten. It was the kind of place that whispered secrets in the dead silence, secrets that no one dared to uncover. The floor creaked beneath unseen feet, each sound echoing through the empty rooms. In the dim light of a flickering candle, shadows danced on the cracked walls, bending and twisting with the wind's mournful cry outside. The house, long forsaken, seemed to breathe with a life of its own. It felt as though the building itself was alive, aching, groaning in the dark, waiting for something, or someone. A lone mirror framed in tarnished brass stood at the far end of a narrow hallway. It was large, its surface just slightly fogged, as if someone had recently breathed against it. The mirror was the only thing left untouched in the house, its reflection unblemished by time or decay. Yet it was more than just a mirror. It had always been a part of the house, a fixture in every room, a piece of the strange puzzle that no one had ever quite solved. Some said it was cursed, others believed it held a doorway to another world, one of shadows and whispers. The wind howled outside, but there was a sudden stillness inside the house, a pause, as if the entire structure was holding its breath. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows down the hallway, but something shifted in the reflection of the mirror. The surface rippled, as if disturbed by an unseen hand. At first it was imperceptible, a slight shift, a flicker in the reflection. But soon the air grew colder, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to move independently of the walls. The mirror, once clear, began to cloud over, and in the fogged glass a figure appeared, a woman. Her face was indistinct at first, a blur of features, but her eyes were too clear, too piercing. They locked onto the observer, even though no one stood before the mirror. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, with terror, and with something else, something darker. A sense of warning, as if the reflection was pleading to be seen, to be understood. The figure in the mirror began to move, slowly, unnervingly. She tilted her head to the side as though listening for something just out of reach. Her expression twisted with a strange kind of familiarity, as though she had been waiting for something or someone for a very long time. The whispers began then, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but quickly growing louder, more insistent. Words in an ancient tongue, slithering from the depths of the mirror. It was as if the reflection itself was speaking, and the woman within it was not just a figure but a vessel for something far older, far more malevolent. The air turned icy, the temperature dropping with each passing second. The mirror's surface began to distort, stretching and pulling as though it was no longer a simple reflection, but a living thing. An opening, and in that opening the woman's face became clearer, sharper. Her eyes, those unblinking, unfeeling eyes, stared directly into the darkness. The house felt different now. It wasn't just abandoned anymore. It was alive, filled with whispers, creaks, and unseen eyes watching from every corner. And as the woman in the mirror began to step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, it became clear. There was no escape from what she had brought with her. Story 2. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath. Dust motes floated lazily in the slivers of light that managed to pierce through the grime-covered window. The heavy scent of decay hung in the air, the kind of smell you could almost taste. The abandoned house, once a family home filled with laughter and life, now stood as a mausoleum to the past. Its windows were dark, its doors locked, its walls sagging under the weight of memories better left forgotten. The mirror stood in the corner of the room, an oddity amidst the ruin. Its frame, gilded and ornate, seemed almost out of place in such a decayed environment, but it was the reflection within it that had always been the true mystery. Those who had come to see it often left in a hurry, unnerved, shaken to their core. There was something about it that called to the darkness, a whisper, a beckoning pull, urging those who looked into it to see what should not be seen. For years, no one had dared approach it. No one had dared disturb its quiet existence. The mirror had become an object of rumor, a relic from a time when the house was alive with activity. People spoke of a woman, an indistinct figure who appeared in its reflection, standing perfectly still, her eyes locked on the viewer. But it was more than that. They said she could follow you, could even step out from the glass and into your world, her gaze hollow and unsettling. Tonight, however, there was no one left to witness it. The house had fallen into complete disrepair. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, but there was no warmth to be found. And yet in the midst of this cold and desolation, something was stirring in the room with the mirror. It began with the slightest of shifts, the faintest tremor of the air, as though the very space around the mirror had become unsettled. At first it was imperceptible, just a ripple on the glass like the first signs of a storm on a quiet lake. The reflection flickered, distorting briefly, then settled back into stillness. But something was wrong. As the minutes passed, the room grew colder. The temperature seemed to drop unnaturally, as if the very walls were exhaling an icy breath. The dust in the air seemed to shift, swirling and pooling in strange patterns, as if being pulled toward the mirror. The air, thick with tension, vibrated with an energy that felt wrong. The figure appeared. At first it was a vague shape in the reflection, a silhouette obscured by shadows. But as the moment stretched on, it began to take form. A woman. Her face was indistinct, just a blur of dark features, but her eyes were unmistakable. They were wide, unblinking, and full of something dark, something that felt as though it was reaching out from the glass, pulling at the very fabric of reality. She stood motionless at the edge of the reflection, her presence almost too much to bear. And then, as if she was aware of being watched, her mouth began to twitch as though trying to form words. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the soft creaking of the house as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The reflection warped again. The woman's form blurred, twisted, and suddenly, her face was much closer, so close that it seemed to press against the glass. Her eyes burned with a feverish intensity, staring directly at the unseen observer. The shadows around her deepened, her outline growing sharper, more defined, and then she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but something colder, something that sent a shiver down the spine. Her hand, impossibly long and thin, reached toward the edge of the mirror. The fingers, delicate and ghostly, brushed against the glass. But the touch felt wrong, as if the very surface of the mirror was a barrier holding back something far more sinister. The woman's smile widened, her lips parted, revealing rows of sharp yellowed teeth. A low whisper echoed in the air, so faint that it was almost imperceptible. It was the sound of a voice that had not spoken in years, decades, perhaps centuries, and it was coming from the mirror. "You cannot leave," the voice hissed. "Once you see her, she will always follow." The temperature plummeted further, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The darkness in the room deepened, becoming a physical presence that pressed against the walls. The room seemed to shrink, as if the house itself were contracting, drawing everything into the center. A loud crack split the silence, like the sound of breaking glass. But the mirror was intact. The woman's reflection, however, was no longer confined to the glass. Her form now stood in the room with the viewer, her eyes locked in an unblinking stare. The whispers grew louder, surrounding the person, wrapping around them like a suffocating fog. They could hear the woman's footsteps, though her feet never touched the floor. The shadow seemed to dance at the edge of the room, pulling in closer, and then, as quickly as it had begun, everything fell silent again. The air returned to normal. The dust settled. The room was still, but the reflection remained. Now the woman was gone, at least from the physical room, but her image still stared back from the mirror, her smile now wide and haunting. The eyes, those eyes, stared into the soul, a reminder that once you looked into the mirror, she would always be there, waiting. Story 3. It had been months since anyone had set foot in the old manor at the edge of the village. The air was thick with neglect, the windows boarded up, and the floorboards creaked beneath the weight of time. The once beautiful mansion, surrounded by towering, twisted trees, now stood as a crumbling relic of a forgotten era. The ivy that clung to the stone walls had grown wild, weaving itself in and out of the cracks in the bricks, as though nature itself was attempting to reclaim the decaying structure. But there was something inside, something that had never left. People whispered about the mirror, a long-forgotten relic in the farthest room of the manor. Those who had dared venture near it spoke of a woman, her reflection haunting the glass, her presence unsettling. They said the mirror was cursed, that anyone who looked into it would never be the same. Some even claimed to have seen her step out from the reflection, though no one had returned to confirm it. The house had fallen into complete disrepair, its walls warped and stained by the passage of time. It was the kind of place that felt wrong. Even the air inside was heavier than it should have been, filled with an oppressive energy that seemed to linger long after the sun had set. The floor was littered with shards of broken furniture, old books and dust-covered frames. Yet there was one room, one dark, forgotten room that still held a secret. At the center of the room, untouched by decay, stood a large, full-length mirror. Its frame was ornate, its surface still gleaming despite the years of dust that had accumulated around it. The mirror, once admired by all, now stood as a testament to the house's decline. No one knew how long it had been there, or who had placed it, but it had remained the one object that seemed to refuse to deteriorate. It reflected nothing but the empty room in front of it, or so it seemed. Late one night, the silence of the house was broken by the softest sound, a creak, barely audible, as though something had shifted. In the stillness, the mirror began to hum, a low vibration that seemed to shake the very air around it. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, vibrating against the walls. It was as if the glass itself was alive, reacting to the dark presence that lingered in the manor. For hours, nothing happened, but then something shifted in the reflection. At first it was subtle. A shadow flickered in the glass, but when the room's dim light shifted, something more pronounced appeared. A figure, a woman, emerged in the mirror, standing perfectly still. Her features were blurred at first, but then the details began to sharpen, revealing her face. She had long dark hair, her eyes large and hollow. Her expression was blank, her gaze unfocused, as though she were staring into something far beyond the room. She was not quite smiling, but there was something unsettling about the way her lips were turned, something that felt wrong. The woman in the mirror did not move. She did not speak, but there was something about her, something in the way she stood, so still and unmoving, that sent a chill down anyone who looked at her. The longer the figure lingered in the glass, the more oppressive the air around the room became. It was as though the walls were closing in, and every breath became heavier, harder to take. At first, there was nothing unusual about the figure, but as the night wore on, the reflection began to change. The woman's posture seemed to shift, as if she were no longer standing passively. She started to lean forward, her body inching toward the glass until her face was almost pressed against it. The glass began to fog with her breath, a mist forming on the surface. Her eyes, which had once been empty, began to change. They grew darker, deeper, as though they were no longer just looking out at the room but reaching inward. The air in the room turned cold, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. Every creak of the house now sounded louder, the floorboards groaning under an unseen weight. The atmosphere thickened, as if the very air around the mirror was absorbing something. A presence, something older than the house itself. And then, there was a sound. A low whisper, soft at first like the wind passing through the trees outside, but then clearer, louder, closer. "You can never leave." The voice came from the mirror, or from somewhere behind it. There was no telling. It felt as if it had come from deep inside the walls, from the very soul of the house. The words were not spoken aloud, but felt, as though they had been etched into the air itself. The whisper was cold, distant yet familiar, like something that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time. The woman's eyes now locked onto the viewer, her pupils constricting with an unnatural intensity. Her hand, delicate and pale, lifted toward the glass. Slowly, deliberately, she pressed her fingers against the surface. And just as she did, the entire room seemed to shudder. The walls groaned, the floor cracked beneath unseen pressure, and the light in the room flickered as if struggling to stay lit. The woman's lips parted, revealing a grin that was far too wide, unnatural, impossible. Her teeth were sharp, yellowed and jagged like the teeth of some beast that had long since abandoned its humanity. And as the grin spread, her form began to shift, morphing. She seemed to grow taller, the reflection warping and stretching with an eerie fluidity, her shadow distorting unnaturally against the walls. And then, with a suddenness that made the air stand still, the reflection was gone. The mirror was empty once again, but the silence did not return. Instead, there was a faint thud, then another, and another, closer now, as if something, or someone, was walking slowly, deliberately toward the viewer. The footsteps grew louder, each one reverberating through the room. The sound came from the mirror, from the space behind it. Each step echoed with the growing dread, and the sense of being watched grew unbearable. In the reflection now, there was no longer just an empty room. The mirror was alive, filled with movement. Shadows shifting, a growing presence behind the glass. The woman's eyes appeared again, watching from the depths, waiting, and the whispers began anew. "You can never leave." This time the voice was not a whisper. It was clear. It was a promise. The mirror's surface rippled, like water disturbed by an unseen hand, and something began to emerge from it. Something otherworldly, something dark. The air around it grew so cold that it burned, and the darkness seemed to press against every inch of the room, suffocating, pulling the viewer toward it. The woman's hand reached forward once again, and this time it did not stop at the glass. She stepped through. Story 4. It was a stormy night when the house felt alive. The wind howled through the broken windows, and rain battered against the walls like the furious whispers of a long-lost spirit. The house, perched at the edge of the town, had been abandoned for years, yet tonight it seemed to be awake, breathing and waiting. The once grand manor had been swallowed by time, left to rot and decay under the weight of forgotten memories. The family that once lived here had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the echoes of their lives. It was said that the house was haunted, but it wasn't just the creaking floors or the soft murmurs that slipped through the walls in the dead of night that kept people away. There was something in the mirror, something the house refused to let go of. It had been there, in the main hallway, for as long as anyone could remember. A tall, ornate mirror, its frame gilded in tarnished gold, standing proudly among the dust and the cobwebs. They said it was cursed, that anyone who dared to look into it would see more than just their reflection. The mirror, it was said, held a woman, a shadow of something long dead, but never truly gone. Most people in town ignored the stories, dismissing them as the ramblings of old folks clinging to superstition. But those who had dared to visit the house were different. They came back shaken, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. They spoke of the woman in the mirror. Some said she was beautiful, others said she was monstrous, but all agreed that she was not a mere reflection. One night, a man named Thomas, a local historian with a deep fascination for the house's history, decided to uncover the truth. He had heard the stories, had seen the townspeople's fear, and he was determined to dispel the myths. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight and his notebook, he entered the house alone, ready to confront whatever lay inside. The door creaked open with a groan, and the smell of mildew and decay hit him immediately. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. The floor was littered with broken furniture, shattered glass, and the remnants of a life long abandoned. But there, in the center of the hallway, stood the mirror. It was just as it had been described, tall with intricate carvings of flowers and vines, its glass surface clear but still reflecting nothing but the emptiness of the hallway. Thomas approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran his fingers over the tarnished frame, feeling the coolness of the metal beneath his touch. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if the house itself were holding its breath. He stood in front of the mirror, gazing into the reflection, half expecting something to happen. Some change, some sign. For a moment, nothing. The reflection was the same as it had been 1,000 times before. The empty hallway stretched behind him, the broken floorboards and peeling wallpaper staring back at him. But then something shifted. A shadow moved in the corner of the reflection, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a woman. No, not a woman, not entirely. Her form was pale, her features indistinct, as if she were made of smoke or mist, barely holding her shape. Her eyes, though, were unmistakable. They were dark, deep pits, filled with an emptiness that seemed to swallow everything around her. Her gaze locked with his. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps his mind playing tricks on him. But as he stared longer, the figure grew clearer, more defined. The woman's face, pale and gaunt, came into sharp focus. Her mouth twisted into a grin, wide and unnaturally so, as if her lips were stretched too tightly across her face. It was a smile, but there was nothing friendly about it. It was cold, predatory. And her eyes, those eyes, were staring directly at him, unblinking, like they could see into his very soul. His breath caught in his throat as he stepped back, but his reflection didn't move. The woman in the mirror, however, did. Her eyes followed his every movement, her head tilting ever so slightly as if she were studying him. The air around him grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. The sound of his own breathing echoed in the silence, but it was becoming harder to breathe. The woman in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. She was something more, something ancient and hungry. The whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible, but they grew louder, closer, until they surrounded him. The woman's lips didn't move, but the words came. "You cannot leave." The voice was soft, melodic, but there was something dark and final about it. It echoed in his mind, drowning out all other sounds. He turned away, trying to flee, but the mirror seemed to pull him in, as if the glass itself were a portal, a gateway to something beyond. His legs felt heavy, as though the very air around him had turned to lead. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, each word slithering into his ears like a snake. "You cannot escape." The room around him began to distort, the walls bending and twisting as if they were no longer bound by the laws of the natural world. The mirror seemed to stretch, the woman's face growing impossibly large in the glass. Her grin widened, her eyes narrowing into slits, and then she stepped forward, her hand reaching toward the glass. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like she was savoring each second of his terror. Thomas reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he backed away, his hands pressed against the cold wall, his chest heaving with each labored breath. But no matter how far he moved, the woman in the mirror was always there, her eyes locked on him, her smile growing wider and more sinister. The last thing he heard was her whisper, soft but chilling, as though it came from inside his own mind. "You will stay with me." The door finally flew open with a violent crash. The woman's form dissipated like mist, fading away into the glass, leaving nothing behind but the reflection of an empty hallway. Thomas stumbled out of the house, his heart racing, his body trembling with a terror he couldn't quite explain. But even as he stepped outside into the storm, he knew one thing. She was still there, watching him. The woman in the mirror was waiting. Story 5. There were stories about the old house at the edge of the village. They were whispered late at night when the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the smell of rain and something else. Something cold. Something dark. The house, an imposing structure of weathered stone and crooked windows, had stood vacant for as long as anyone could remember. Its doors were locked, the gardens overrun with thorns and weeds, and its roof sagged under the weight of time. But the stories, those stories never stopped. They said that the house was cursed, that something lingered within, something that could never escape. People spoke of a mirror, a tall antique mirror that had been placed in the house years ago, left behind when the last family had mysteriously disappeared. The mirror, it was said, reflected not only what stood before it, but what was hidden beneath the surface, what could not be seen with the naked eye. The villagers spoke of a woman who appeared in the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The mirror, they said, would show her only to those who dared to look deeply enough. No one knew exactly who the woman was or why she haunted the glass, but everyone agreed on one thing. Once you saw her, she would follow you. She would be there, just behind your reflection, watching. For years the house remained abandoned, its windows boarded up, its doors sealed tight. No one went near it, not even to pick the wild roses that grew around its perimeter, their petals dark and wilted, like the house itself. But one night, a young woman named Claire, tired of hearing the stories and drawn to the mystery, decided to visit. She had heard all the tales, the ones her grandmother had told her as a child, the ones whispered in hushed voices around town. But Claire was different. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses. She was a skeptic, a rational thinker, and the allure of the house's forgotten secrets was too much for her to resist. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and her curiosity, she crossed the overgrown path toward the front door of the manor. The door creaked open as though it had been waiting for her. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust, and the silence was suffocating. Claire stepped inside, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The floor beneath her feet groaned, old wooden beams protesting against the weight of time. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the place settle over her. The house was frozen in time, the furniture draped in white sheets, old paintings hanging crookedly on the walls. It was as though no one had lived there for years, but somehow the house still felt alive. She made her way through the hall, her flashlight beam dancing across the walls, until she reached the room at the end. The door was cracked open. Inside, amidst the dust and cobwebs, stood the mirror. It was massive. Its frame was intricately carved with images of flowers and leaves, but the gold had long since dulled, tarnished by years of neglect. The glass, however, remained unnaturally clear, untouched by time. There was something about it that seemed wrong, as though the reflection it offered wasn't quite right. Claire stepped closer, her heartbeat quickening with a mix of curiosity and dread. She peered into the mirror, her own reflection staring back at her, her pale face, wide eyes, and the faintest tremor in her hand as she held the flashlight. But as she stared deeper, something began to shift. The edges of her reflection blurred, warping unnaturally, and she saw it. A face, pale and distorted, creeping into the frame. It wasn't her own. The woman's eyes were empty, dark voids, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural, twisted grin. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She tried to step back, but her legs felt heavy as though they were cemented to the floor. The woman in the mirror moved, slowly, deliberately. Her mouth opened, and Claire could hear a faint, barely audible whisper, like a voice coming from far away. "You can't escape me." The whisper echoed around the room, surrounding Claire, chilling her to the bone. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest, but the woman in the mirror didn't stop. She leaned forward, her face distorting, elongating as if trying to push through the glass. The glass itself rippled like water disturbed by a stone. The woman's dark eyes locked onto Claire's, her smile growing wider, more twisted. Claire turned to flee, but the door to the room slammed shut, trapping her inside. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and suffocating. She pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The mirror, however, was no longer a reflection. It was something else. The woman was stepping out, her fingers long and skeletal, pressed against the surface of the glass, the reflection twisting and stretching around them. Claire backed away, her pulse racing, but the woman continued to move, inching closer to her. With each step, the house seemed to groan, the walls shaking as though the structure itself was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. The woman in the mirror, no, not a woman, something darker, something older, smiled, and Claire felt it then, a coldness creeping into her bones. The whisper came again, this time clearer, closer. "You're mine now." And then, in a flash, the room was still. The mirror stood empty, the woman's face gone. Claire, trembling and frozen in place, dared to look. Her reflection was normal. Her wide eyes, her pale face, the flicker of the flashlight's beam. But there was something wrong. Something in the way her reflection moved. Her reflection smiled. And it wasn't Claire's smile. The room fell silent, save for the sound of Claire's own breathing, shallow and erratic. The reflection, her reflection, began to move on its own, separate from her. Its mouth opened and it whispered, louder now, the voice unmistakably dark and mocking. "You'll never leave." In that moment, Claire realized the truth. The mirror wasn't just a reflection, it was a doorway, and whatever had been inside, whatever had lived behind the glass, was now free, free to follow her, to whisper in her ear, to crawl into her thoughts. The last thing Claire heard was the soft, mocking laughter echoing in the silence as her reflection, her dark twin, stepped forward.